Killing Mr. Griffin, Chapter 1. It was a wild, windy, southwestern spring when the idea of killing Mr. Griffin occurred to them. As she crossed the playing field to reach the school building, Susan McConnell leaned into the wind and cupped her hands around the edges of her glasses to keep the blowing red dust from filling her eyes. Tumbleweeds swept past her like small, furry animals, rushing to pile in drifts against the fence that separated the field from the parking lot. The parked cars all had their windows up, as though against a rainstorm. In the distance, the rugged sandy mountains rose in faint outline, almost obscured by the pinkish haze. I hate spring, Susan told herself vehemently. I hate dust and wind. I wish we lived somewhere else. Someday. It was a word she used often. Someday. Someday, she had said at the breakfast table that very morning. Someday I'm going to live in a cabin on the shore of a lake where everything is peaceful and green, and the only sound is lapping water. As soon as the words were out, she had longed to snatch them back again. How are you going to pay the property taxes? Her father had asked in his usual reasonable way. Lakeshore property doesn't come cheap, you know. Somebody's going to have to finance that lovely green nest of yours. A rich husband, her brother Craig had shouted, and the twins, who were 7, had broken into jeers and laughter. Not too soon, I hope, her mother had said, turning from the stove with the frying pan in her hand. Marry in haste, repent at leisure. That's what my grandmother always said. There's plenty of time for everything. For being an old maid, the twin named Kevin had offered, giggling. Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. McConnell had told him. Nobody's even ever an old maid these days. The term is single person. Now, who wants eggs? Someday, Susan had thought, sinking lower in her chair, someday I am going to move out of this house and away from this family. I'll live all alone in a place where I can read and write and think, and the only time I'll ever come here is for Christmas. Are you going to be a single person, Sue? The twin named Alex had asked with false innocence, jabbing his brother with his elbow, and Craig had grinned with maddening 12-year-old self-assurance and said, You've got to go out on dates before you get married, and Sue hasn't even started that yet. All things in good time, Mrs. McConnell had told them mildly, and Mr. McConnell had said, Speaking of property taxes, and they'd been off to another subject. And Susan, with her eyes on her plate, had told herself silently, Someday. Someday. The dust stung the sides of her face, filling her nose and coating her lips. With a whir and a flutter, half a dozen sheets of notebook paper went flying past her like strange white birds released suddenly from the confinement of their cage. Grab them, somebody shouted. Get them before they go over the fence. Susan turned to see David Ruggles running toward her, the slightness and delicacy of his bone structure giving him the framework of a kite with his blue windbreaker. Billowing out beneath his arms, the wind seemingly to lift and carry him. He called by her, grabbing frantically, and then escaping papers. Susan dropped her hands from their protective encasement of their glasses and snatched wildly at the air. The paper she was trying for lurched suddenly on the ground in front of her, and her foot came down upon it, grinding it into the dirt. Susan stopped and snatched it up. It's torn. The dirty imprint of her shoe was stamped irrevocably in the center. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter, David shrugged his shoulders and reached to take the paper from her hand. The rest of it's blown away anyhow. One ripped page isn't going to make any difference. If it's not all there, Griffin won't take any of it. Is it a song for Ophelia? Yeah. It's supposed to be, but I'm sure Griffin would have called it something else. I haven't done anything right yet for him. Neither have I. I don't think anyone has. Susan fell into a step beside him, her heart lifting suddenly, her depression disappearing. The wind wasn't so bad after all, for it had blown this luck upon her, the unbelievable, undreamed of event of herself. Susan McConnell entering the halls of Del Norte High School side by side with the beautiful, popular David Ruggles, president of the senior class. For the last year of her life, Susan had dreamed about David every night, at least every night in which she could remember having a dream. In some of the dreams, he smiled at her, the open, sweet, heart-clenching smile that belonged to him alone. In others, they sat and talked for hour after hour, sharing with each other private thoughts and longings. Never yet had there been a dream in which they walked shoulder to shoulder into English class, with everyone, even Betsy Klein, turning to stare, to envy, to wonder. When they reached the door in the building, David struggled with it. pulling with all the weight of his slight frame as the wind forced it closed. For a moment, it seemed it would be a draw, but in the end, David won, and he and Susan staggered into the crowded hallway where numerous other red-faced, wind-torn students laughed, jostled, shoved tangled hair out of their faces, and shouted things like, "So much for my hair, and look what the wind just blew in." Susan took off her glasses and wiped the dust from the lenses with the front of her blouse. By the time she put them back on, David had moved away from her. She started to press forward to regain her place beside him, but others had already fallen into it. Mark Kinney, lean, expressionless, cool. Jeff Garrett, big, loud, broad-shouldered. "Hey, Dave, where were you last night, man?" Jeff asked. "We looked for you after the game." "I had to miss it. Sorry. 3 hours worth of homework. 2 of them for Griffin's class, I'll bet. A lot of good it did to me. Whole stupid assignment blew out of my hands on the way in here." They were too far ahead of her now for her to hear them, and Susan accepted defeat. It didn't really matter anyway. Walking into class beside David Ruggles would have been a farce, and everyone would have known it. Another girl might have pulled it off, someone more sophisticated than she, someone used to walking beside attractive boys and chatting gaily and smiling disarmingly. The only attractive boys Susan ever walked beside were named McConnell, and most of the time, she hated all 3 of them. "Oh well," she thought wryly, "at least I stepped on his paper. That's more than has ever happened before. Next time we meet, he'll know who I am, the girl with the dirty shoes." Alex's question came back to her. "Are you going to be a single person, Sue?" "No." "Yes." "Probably. Wasn't that an appropriate fate for someone like Susan McConnell? Someone with a handsome father and gorgeous, vivacious mother whose looks had all been poured into 3 dreadful, handsome, smart-ass little boys? But that was for now. Things did sometimes change. Someday. Someday what? Her boniness would blossom into curves. She would get contact lenses. She, who had been told by not 1, but 2, but 3 different doctors that her corneas weren't shaped right to allow her to wear them. Someday she would turn into a heart-stopping beauty overnight. Is that what would happen? Why did she keep trying to fool herself by thinking someday, when the word was actually never? Morosely, Susan let the tide of bodies sweep her on down the hall and into the door of room 117. She paused in the doorway long enough to glance about the room. The boys were there ahead of her, David already in his accustomed seat, 3 from the back in the 5th row, Jeff Block in the center aisle as he stood by Mark's desk, continuing their conversation. In the seat in front of David, Betsy Klein turned and said something in a low-pitched, conspirational manner. David smiled and nodded. Sure that she would be unable to wedge herself past Jeff and too shy to ask him to move, Susan entered the room along the side aisle in order to approach her desk from the opposite direction. She smiled tentatively at 2 girls in the front of the row, but they were talking to each other and did not seem to notice her. So she let her eyes shift away from them and clung tightly to the smile, as though it had not been for them at all, but for some private joke that had come suddenly into her mind. She smiled all the way up the aisle, only letting her face relax when she slipped into her seat. She glanced up at the wall clock at the front of the room. 2 minutes to 9. 2 minutes for friends to chatter to each other while Susan stared at her desktop. Why was it some people, girls like Betsy for instance, were noticed and spoken to and appreciated without ever making the slightest effort? It was not all folks, certainly. When you analyzed Betsy, she was not really pretty. She had a round, snub-nosed, pussycat face and short, muscular cheerleader legs and a sprinkling of flat freckles. But ask anyone, even the newest of the freshmen, who is that girl over there? And the answer you got would be, that's Betsy Klein. Doesn't everyone know her? The large hand on the wall clock snapped forward with an inaudible click. 1 minute now until class time. Susan opened her purse and rummaged through it, pretending to be looking for something important. It was easier than simply sitting or than trying again with the smile routine. In other classes, it was not quite as difficult. For one thing, she was a straight-A student, and people had questions to ask her about homework. Here in English literature and composition, there was no such thing as an A student. With all her effort, she was earning B's. Even so, it was more than most of the other students were getting. The mid-semester exam had been a disaster for everyone, and it was rumored that the final was being constructed so that it would be impossible for even the brightest student to pass. Griffin must be lying awake at night, Jeff Garrett had commented yesterday in the cafeteria. He's trying to think of questions that don't have answers. His voice had rung through the room, and everyone had started laughing, knowing whom he was talking about, even if they had missed bearing a name. Susan dug into the open purse and drew out a felt pen, a stick of gum, a dime, and 2 pennies. She examined them with affected interest before letting them fall back again. The hand of the clock moved forward, one final click. The bell rang, and Mr. Griffin stepped through the doorway into the classroom, pulling the door shut behind him. The day had officially begun. Never once could Susan recall a morning when Mr. Griffin had not been standing in front of them in the precise moment the bell stopped ringing. Other teachers might saunter in late, delayed in the teacher's lounge for a last drag on a cigarette or a final swallow of morning coffee. Other teachers might pause in the hall to secure a button or tie a shoestring. Other teachers might sometimes not appear at all, while an organized substitute stumbled over the lesson plans and finally gave up and let everybody out early. But Mr. Griffin was always there, as reliable as the bell itself. Stiff and straight in a navy blue suit, white shirt and tie, his dark hair slicked flat against his head, his mouth firm and uncompromising beneath the small, neatly trimmed mustache. His eyes moved steadily up and down the rows, taking a silent roll call as the buzz of conversation dwindled and faded to silence. "Good morning, class," he said. Susan answered automatically, her voice jointly the uneasy chorus. "Good morning, Mr. Griffin. Please take out your homework assignments and then pass them to the front. Miss Klein, will you collect them, please?" Susan opened the folder and withdrew the sheets of paper on which she had printed the verses she had composed the night before. In the seat behind her, Jeff raised his hand. "Mr. Garrett?" "I don't have mine finished yet, Mr. Griffin. There was a basketball game last night, and I was on one of the starters. That must have created a great problem for you, Mr. Garrett." "I couldn't very well skip the game, could I?" Jeff said. "The team was counting on me. We were playing El Dorado." "Basketball is indeed as important reason for attending high school," Mr. Griffin said in an expressionless voice. "The ability to drop balls through baskets will serve you well in life. It may keep your wrists limber into old age. Mr. Ruggles, your hand is raised. Do you have a similar disclosure to make?" "I did the assignment, sir," David said. "It blew out of my notebook. I'll redo it tonight." "I have never accepted late papers on windy days." "Miss Klein?" "I didn't understand the assignment," Betsy said. Her eyes were wide and worried. "How can anybody write a final song for Ophelia when she's already said everything there is to say? All that about Rosemary being for remembrance and everything, nothing happens to her after that except she drowns." "There are those who might consider suicide an event of some importance in a young woman's life," Mr. Griffin said dryly. "Are there any other comments?" The room was silent. "Then will those of you who are able to find some final words for poor Ophelia please pass them forward?" "At least we don't have to read them aloud," Susan thought in relief. That was a possibility she had not thought about last night when she sat at her desk in her room, letting the words pour from her. There, caught by the magic of the painful story, she had let herself become Ophelia, lonely, alienated from the world, sickened with the hopelessness of her love, gazing into the depths of the water that would soon become her grave. Only this morning, as she was leaving the house, had the horrible thought occurred to her. What if he makes us read the songs in class? There was no way that she could have done that. Too much of Susan lay exposed in the neatly printed verses, intermixed with the persona of Ophelia. Now she scanned her words again. "Where the daisies lay and blow, where the willow leaves hang down, Nanny, Nanny, I will go, there to weave my lord a crown. Willow, willow, by the brook, trailing fingers green and long, I will read my lord a book, I will sing my love a song. Though he turn his face away, Nanny, Nanny, still I sing, ditties of a heart gone gray, and a hand that bears no ring. Water, water, cold and deep." "Miss McConnell, have you completed your meditation?" Mr. Griffin's voice broke in upon her. "I'm sorry." Susan felt her face growing hot with embarrassment. "I was just checking the spelling." Hurriedly, she thrust her papers into the hand of the girl in front of her. "An excellent idea, but it might have been done before now. As for those who have no paper to turn in, you may consider your grade an F for this assignment. Now, open your books, please, to the first scene in Act 3. "But, Mr. Griffin, that's not fair," Jeff burst out. "If we miss doing the assignment, we should be allowed to do a makeup." "Why is that, Mr. Garrett?" "Other teachers take late papers," Jeff said. "In fact, most teachers don't give assignments at all on game nights." "Dolly Luna?" "What Miss Luna does is no concern of mine. She teaches her class according to her policies," Mr. Griffin told him. "My own policy happens to be teach English literature, If students wish to take part in extracurricular activities, that's fine, but they should be just that, extracurricular activities. Any student who allows them to interfere with his academic responsibilities must be prepared to accept the consequences. And the consequences are F's, is that it? Jeff's voice was shaken with outrage. Well, there happens to be a lot of us who think there's more to life than trying to outdo Shakespeare. When we do turn stuff in, it comes back so marked up that nobody can read it. Spelling, grammar, punctuation, everything's got to be so freaking perfect. Cool it, Mark Kinney said quietly. He sat slouching in his seat in his usual don't care position, his odd, heavy-lidded eyes giving a deceptively sleepy appearance. Just sort of overexcited, Mr. J. But what he's getting at is that most of us are seniors in this class. We need this credit to graduate. We sure do, Jeff sputtered. By handing out F's wholesale, you may be knocking a bunch of us out of graduation. It's not fair to us, or to our parents, or even to the school. What are they going to do next fall when 20 or so of us are back trying to get one lousy English credit? It's interesting to contemplate, isn't it? Mr. Griffin said mildly. But I advise you not to be lulled into a false sense of security by the thought that it can't be done. I am quite capable of holding back anyone I feel has not qualified for a passing grade, a fact which your friend, Mr. Kinney, can support. His head slanted to his jacket pocket and brought out a small plastic bottle. Without seeming so much as a glance at it, he snapped it open, took out a pill, and popped it into his mouth. Then he recapped the bottle and placed it back in the pocket. Please open your books to Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. We'll now review for a quiz I have scheduled for Monday. You do have your books with you, don't you, Mr. Garrett? Yes, I do, sir, Jeff said hoarsely. The wind continued to blow. Gazing through the window toward the parking lot, Susan could barely make out the rows of cars, veiled as they were swirling dust. Out of this wild, pink world, a bird came flying, half blinded, carried by the wind, and crashed headlong into the window pane. Its beak crumpled against the glass, and it seemed to hang there in an instant, stunned by the impact, before it dropped like a feather-covered stone to the ground below. Poor thing, Susan thought. Poor little thing. Poor bird. Poor Ophelia. Poor Susan. She had a sudden, irrational urge to put her head down on the desk and weep for all of them, for the whole world, for the awful day that was starting so badly and would certainly get no better. From his seat behind her, she heard Jeff Garrett mumble under his breath, "That Griffin's the sort of guy you'd like to kill." That was Chapter 1, Killing Mr. Griffin.